A nation is reeling. In the space of less than a minute, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake struck the heart of Colombia, and when the shaking stopped, the city of Pereira lay broken, whole neighborhoods buried under rubble, and a country was plunged into grief and crisis. The images that emerge from the disaster zone are ones of devastation, collapsed buildings, streets choked with debris. Families searching for the missing, a region shattered by the sudden violence of the earth. But beyond the immediate horror of the collapse and the desperate search for survivors lies a larger story. The story of how an entire nation absorbs and responds to a catastrophe of this magnitude, of the shock that ripples out from the epicenter to touch the whole country. Of the enormous effort to care for the survivors and rebuild what was lost, and of the long and difficult road that lies ahead for Pereira and for Colombia. This is the story of a nation shattered, and of the resilience with which it must now confront the aftermath of one of the most devastating disasters it has ever faced. The shock that struck a nation when a great earthquake strikes a city, it does not only devastate that city, it sends a shock through the entire nation. And to understand the full meaning of the disaster in Pereira, you have to understand how it reverberates across all of Colombia. Pereira is not an isolated place. It is a significant city. A regional hub in the heart of the country's beloved coffee region, connected by ties of family, commerce, and identity to the whole of the nation. When it is struck, the blow is felt far beyond its borders, in the anxious phone calls of relatives across the country trying to reach loved ones in the disaster zone, in the mobilization of the national government and its resources, in the outpouring of concern and solidarity from Colombians everywhere, and in the sudden, collective realization that catastrophe has struck the nation. This national dimension of the disaster shapes everything that follows. The response is not merely local, but national, drawing on the resources and the capacities of the entire country as the government declares emergency, deploys the military and national agencies, and marshals the nation's ability to respond to the crisis. The grief, too, is national, as the whole country watches the images from Pereira and mourns the losses, feeling the disaster as a wound to the nation itself. And the disruption ripples outward through the connections that bind the region to the rest of the country, affecting the economy. The flow of goods and people, and the sense of security of a nation reminded, in the most brutal way, of its vulnerability to the forces of the earth. The shock that struck Pereira is thus a shock that struck all of Colombia, and the story of the disaster is the story not just of one broken city, but of a nation confronting catastrophe together. Its people and its institutions called upon to respond to a crisis that belongs to the whole country. This is the larger frame within which the tragedy of Pereira unfolds, the recognition that when a great earthquake shatters a city, it shakes a nation to its core. The human toll at the center of every earthquake disaster is the human toll, the profound and terrible cost measured in lives lost. In people injured, in families torn apart, in communities devastated, and it is this human dimension that makes the catastrophe in Pereira so heartbreaking and so important to confront honestly. When buildings collapse and neighborhoods are buried under rubble, the cost is not measured in concrete and steel, but in human beings, in the men, women, and children who were caught in the falling structures, in those who were killed, in those who were injured, and in those who survived but lost the people and the homes they loved. The human toll of a great earthquake unfolds in waves. There are those killed in the initial collapse, the immediate victims of the falling buildings, whose deaths are the first and most terrible measure of the disaster. There are the injured, sometimes in enormous numbers, suffering from wounds and crushing injuries and the effects of the trauma, straining the medical capacity of the region as they seek treatment. There are the trapped, buried in the rubble, whose fate hangs on the desperate efforts to reach them in time. And there are the vast numbers of survivors who, though physically unhurt, have been profoundly affected by the disaster, having lost loved ones, homes, livelihoods, and the sense of security that the solid ground once provided. The human toll extends into the families and communities of all these victims, into the grief of those who mourn, the trauma of those who survived, and the disruption of countless lives. It is a toll that will be counted in the days and weeks after the disaster, as the full scope of the losses becomes clear. and felt for years afterward in the grief and the memory of those who lived through it. The human toll is the true measure of the catastrophe, the reason that the disaster in Pereira matters so deeply, and the reason that the response to it must be, above all, an effort to care for and protect the human beings whose lives have been shattered by the shaking of the earth. A city without shelter, one of the most immediate and pressing crises to emerge in the aftermath of a great earthquake, and one that defines the experience of the survivors in Pereira, is the crisis of shelter. The sudden reality that vast numbers of people have lost their homes and have nowhere to go. A crisis that must be addressed urgently, even as the search for survivors continues. When an earthquake destroys and damages buildings across a city, it does not only kill and injure, it renders enormous numbers of people homeless, driving them out of structures that have collapsed or been damaged, or that are simply too dangerous to re-enter. The shelter crisis is immense and multifaceted. There are those whose homes have been destroyed outright, who have lost everything and have nowhere to return to. There are those whose homes are damaged and unsafe, who cannot go back until the structures can be assessed and repaired. And there are those who are simply too frightened to return indoors, afraid of the aftershocks that continue to strike, and of the possibility that their weakened homes might collapse. Choosing instead to sleep outdoors in the open, in parks and streets in open spaces, away from the buildings they no longer trust. The result is a vast population of the displaced, tens of thousands or more, who must be sheltered, fed, and cared for in the aftermath of the disaster, an enormous humanitarian challenge that the response must meet, even as it deals with the injured and the trapped. Shelters must be established, tents and temporary housing provided, and the basic needs of the displaced, food, water, sanitation, medical care, met in the chaotic environment of the disaster zone. The shelter crisis is one of the defining challenges of the aftermath, a reflection of the way a great earthquake unhouses a population in an instant. And its resolution is a crucial part of caring for the survivors and beginning the recovery. In the days after the disaster, the sight of thousands of people sheltering in the open, having lost or fled their homes, is one of the most poignant images of the catastrophe, a testament to the scale of the disruption and the depth of the need. The nation responds in the face of a catastrophe of this magnitude. The nation mobilizes, and the response that unfolds in the aftermath of the earthquake is an enormous undertaking, drawing on the resources of the government, the capacities of countless institutions and individuals, and the solidarity of a nation determined to help its own. Understanding this response is essential to understanding how a country confronts and begins to recover from a disaster of this scale. The response begins with the immediate emergency, the mobilization of rescue teams, medical personnel, the military, and emergency services to save lives, treat the injured, and care for the displaced. The national government declares a state of emergency, unlocking resources and coordinating the response across the many agencies and levels of government involved. The military is often deployed to assist, bringing its personnel, equipment, and organizational capacity to the effort, helping with search and rescue, the distribution of aid, and the enormous logistics of responding to a disaster. Medical resources are directed to the affected area to treat the flood of injured. Supplies of food, water, shelter, and other necessities are gathered and distributed to the survivors. And the response draws not only on the government, but on the wider society, on the volunteers who converge on the disaster zone, on the organizations that provide aid and support, and on the ordinary citizens across the nation who donate and help in whatever ways they can. The response may also draw on international assistance, as other nations and organizations offer help, resources, and specialized teams to support the stricken country. This vast, coordinated effort is the nation's answer to the catastrophe, its determination to save whom it can, to care for the survivors, and to begin the work of recovery. The effectiveness of this response, its speed, its reach, its capacity, is a crucial factor in determining the toll of the disaster and the course of the recovery, and it represents the mobilization of a nation's resources and its will in the face of a crisis that has shattered one of its cities. The wound to the coffee, heartland the disaster in Pereira, carries a particular economic and cultural dimension because it strikes at the heart of Colombia's famous coffee region, one of the most productive and beloved parts of the country, and the wound to this region reaches beyond the immediate destruction into the economy and identity of the nation. Pereira and the surrounding area lie in the coffee-growing heartland, a region whose fertile mountain slopes produce much of the coffee for which Colombia is renowned around the world, and whose economy and way of life are bound up with the cultivation of the crop. A great earthquake striking this region does damage that ripples through its economy and its future. Beyond the destruction of homes and buildings, the disaster can disrupt the agricultural economy on which the region depends, damaging farms and infrastructure, disrupting the labor and systems that sustain the coffee cultivation, and dealing a blow to the livelihoods of the many people who depend on the crop. The region is not only agricultural, but also a center of commerce, industry, and population, so the disruption of its economy affects not only the coffee growers, but the whole web of economic activity the region supports. And there is a cultural dimension as well, for the coffee region holds a cherished place in the national identity of Colombia, a symbol of the country's landscape, its heritage, and its place in the world. So that a blow to this region is felt as a blow to something precious and iconic in the life of the nation. The wound to the coffee heartland is thus both economic and symbolic, a disruption of a vital part of the national economy and an injury to a beloved region, and its recovery will matter not only for the people who live there, but for the economy and the spirit of the whole country. As the region begins the long work of recovery, it faces the challenge of rebuilding not only its homes, but its economy and its way of life, of restoring the coffee heartland to health after the shattering blow of the earthquake. The invisible wounds. Beyond the visible devastation of the collapsed buildings and the physical injuries of the victims, a great earthquake inflicts wounds that cannot be seen, the deep psychological trauma that afflicts the survivors of such a catastrophe, and this invisible dimension of the disaster is a crucial part of its human toll and of the long recovery that must follow. The experience of living through a great earthquake, of feeling the solid ground turn violent, of watching buildings collapse and neighbors die, of losing loved ones and homes, of surviving buried in rubble or fleeing in terror, leaves marks on the mind and the spirit that endure long after the physical wounds have healed. The psychological toll of the disaster takes many forms. There is the acute trauma of the experience itself, the terror and the horror of the earthquake and its immediate aftermath, which can leave survivors in shock, unable to process what has happened. There is the grief for those who were lost, a grief made all the more difficult by the sudden and violent nature of the deaths and by the sheer scale of the loss across the community. There is the ongoing fear and anxiety that the aftershocks and the memory of the disaster produce, the difficulty of feeling safe again in a world where the ground itself has proven treacherous. And there is the longer-term trauma that can afflict survivors for years, the lasting psychological effects of having lived through a catastrophe, which can shape lives long after the disaster has passed. These invisible wounds are a real and serious part of the toll, affecting vast numbers of survivors, and their healing is an important part of the recovery, requiring attention to the mental health and emotional well-being of a traumatized population. They remind us that the cost of a disaster is not only physical, but psychological, that the survivors carry the earthquake with them in their minds long after the rubble has been cleared, and that the true recovery from such a catastrophe must address not only the rebuilding of homes, but the healing of the deep and lasting wounds the disaster inflicts upon the human spirit. The long road of rebuilding, when the immediate emergency has passed. When the survivors have been rescued, and the injured treated, and the displaced sheltered, the shattered city and region face the long and daunting road of rebuilding, a process that will unfold over years, and that represents an immense challenge of its own, distinct from the drama of the disaster itself. The rebuilding of a city after a great earthquake is a vast undertaking, encompassing the physical reconstruction of homes and buildings and infrastructure, the restoration of the economy, and the rebuilding of communities and lives, and it tests the endurance and the resources of the affected region and the nation long after the disaster has faded from the world's attention. The physical rebuilding is enormous in scale. The rubble of the collapsed buildings must be cleared, a massive task in itself. The damaged and destroyed structures must be repaired or replaced, requiring resources, labor, and time on a huge scale. The infrastructure of the city, the roads, the water and power systems, the public buildings must be restored. And crucially, the rebuilding offers an opportunity, if it is seized, to build back better and safer, to replace the vulnerable structures that failed in the earthquake with new ones built to withstand future shaking, and in this way to reduce the region's vulnerability to the disasters yet to come. But rebuilding is slow and costly, and for the people whose homes and livelihoods were destroyed, the road back is long and hard, marked by displacement, hardship, and uncertainty. Beyond the physical rebuilding, there is the economic recovery, the restoration of the businesses, farms, and industries that sustain the region, and the human recovery, the healing of the survivors, and the rebuilding of the lives that the disaster shattered. The long road of rebuilding is walked by the people of Pereira and the coffee region for years after the earth has stilled. A reminder that the true cost of a great earthquake is measured not only in the terrible moments of the disaster, but in the extended struggle of recovery that follows, a struggle that will define the future of the region for a generation. The resilience of a people. Amid all the devastation and grief, there emerges from the disaster in Pereira a quality that is perhaps the most important of all in determining how a community recovers from such a catastrophe: the resilience of the people, the capacity of human beings and communities to endure, to help one another, and to rebuild in the face of even the most shattering adversity. This resilience is not an abstraction, but a living reality, visible in the countless acts of courage, compassion, and determination that unfold in the aftermath of the disaster, and it is the deepest source of hope in the midst of the horror. The resilience of a people is seen in the neighbors who dig through the rubble to save one another, in the volunteers who give their time and effort to help the stricken, in the survivors who, despite their own losses, reach out to support others, in the communities that come together in the face of the catastrophe with a solidarity that transcends the ordinary divisions of daily life. It is seen in the determination to rebuild, to restore what was lost, to carry on in the face of unimaginable adversity, a determination that drives the long and difficult work of recovery, and it is seen in the enduring spirit of a people who, though shattered by the disaster, refuse to be broken by it, who mourn their losses and yet find the strength to face the future and to rebuild their lives and their communities. This resilience is the human answer to the indifferent power of the earthquake, and it is, in the end, the quality that will determine how Pereira and the coffee region recover. For while the earthquake shattered the city, it cannot shatter the resilience of the people, and it is upon that resilience, as much as upon the resources and systems of the response, that the recovery ultimately depends. In the aftermath, amid the rubble and the grief, this resilience shines through, a reminder that even in the face of the most devastating catastrophe, the human capacity to endure and to rebuild remains, and that the shattered city will, in time and through great effort, rise again. Learning from the rubble finally, the disaster in Pereira, like every great earthquake, carries lessons that reach beyond the immediate catastrophe, lessons that, if heeded, can reduce the toll of the disasters yet to come. And drawing these lessons from the rubble is perhaps the most important legacy that such a catastrophe can leave: the devastation of Pereira, the collapsed buildings, and the buried neighborhoods. Points to a set of hard truths about earthquakes and about how nations and communities can protect themselves from their worst effects. The deepest lesson is that the horror of the disaster is shaped enormously by human choices, above all by how buildings are constructed and how communities prepare. The earthquake itself is inevitable, an unavoidable feature of a country built upon active geology, but the collapse of buildings and the deaths that follow are not. Structures built to withstand earthquakes can survive even powerful shaking, while vulnerable buildings fail and become the tombs of those inside. The single most important thing that Colombia and every earthquake-prone nation can do to reduce the toll of future disasters is to ensure that its buildings are built to resist the shaking, and to enforce the codes that make earthquake-resistant construction the norm. Alongside this, the lessons of preparedness, of trained rescue capacity, of planning and coordination, of public education, of the systems that protect people when disaster strikes, all point toward how a nation can meet the inevitable earthquake with resilience rather than helplessness. The disaster in Pereira, terrible as it is, offers Colombia and the world an opportunity to learn, to strengthen the defenses against the next earthquake, and in this way to honor the losses of this one by reducing the losses of those to come. This is the hope within the horror, the understanding that even a catastrophe can teach, and that the lessons learned from the rubble of Pereira can, if applied, make the nation safer in the face of the earthquakes that the restless ground beneath Colombia will surely bring again. As the shattered city mourns and rebuilds, this is the enduring task, to learn from the disaster so that its terrible cost is not paid in vain, and so that Colombia emerges from the catastrophe